The medieval times were certainly no breeze, and a lot of dark things took place. No matter how close the relationship, there were certainly some strange and horrifying practices, and marriage was no exception. From being forced to stray from marriage to the involvement of the church, all the way to the horrific coercion that occurred far too often. On today's top 10 list, we will be diving into 10 more dark things people did in medieval marriages. And I'll be shouting out a few of your comments from the first portion of this video at the end, so make sure you stick around to see if your comment will be featured. Let's get into it. Starting off this list in our number 10 spot, we have courtly love. We've discussed a lot on these lists how medieval marriages were mostly about the transferring of wealth and land, and really didn't have much, if anything, to do with love. This would be obviously a less than ideal way of living, so to make things a little more bearable, there was the practice of courtly love. This, of course, was for members of the court, and it allowed lords and ladies to experience love despite their marital status. This was actually a huge hit, and so many people became involved that there ended up being a list of rules posted, and one of which included the rule, marriage is no real excuse for not loving. That's not really a rule, I guess that's more of just a saying. The courtly love saw people doing things such as dancing and giggling, and if they really wanted to get a little risque, they'd even hold hands. Sex, of course, was forbidden, however, because there are some boundaries while being married. It's just sad that people were in these loveless marriages and had to resort to things like this, all because they simply weren't allowed to marry for love. I am glad, though, that they were able to have some kind of freedom. In our number 9 spot today, we have funeral shrouds. Before I dive into this one, guys, please don't forget to hit the thumbs up button if you're enjoying the video so far, because it really helps us out. In part 1 of this video, we talked about how women who were in a lower income family often were unable to purchase any sort of garment that would be specifically used for their wedding, due to the fact that it was just unreasonable for them to be able to purchase an item that would only be used once. This didn't only extend to dresses, but also to veils, which many women already owned. What I want to add on to that thought for today's video, however, is that those veils were often also used in another large life event, and that would be their funeral. It's quite sad to think of the garment being shared on these two separate occasions. Nowadays, we would think of a wedding as one of the happiest moments and celebrations of a person's life, but in the medieval times, marriage was often only slightly better than one's funeral. In our number 8 spot today, we have the Holy Sacrament. Marriage ceremonies have come a long way from what they used to be like, and actually a lot of people in the medieval times didn't even have a ceremony at all. Couples didn't need permission to marry before like we do now. All that was required for a marriage to be binding was that both parties uttered consent to the marriage, and this could be done in their bed, in the pub, in the middle of the street. It really didn't matter. But this is the practice that led to marriage becoming what it is today. Because officials were unable to prove if people were actually married, whatever that means, of course they got the church involved in the process. This is the reason why marriage began to be declared as a holy sacrament that needed to be observed by God. In our number 7 spot today, we have extracurricular activity. The church certainly had a view of marriage that was to control sexual activity. Any of this sort of intimacy outside of marriage was completely unacceptable and considered sinful, and sex within marriage was only meant to be for the purpose of procreation. In fact, many people believed that if these activities took place in a marriage outside of procreation, that it would be a bad thing. St. Jerome stated in the 4th century that a man who is too passionately in love with his wife is an adulterer, and this was a sentiment taken seriously by the people of the church in these times. These were the rules surrounding who was allowed to participate, but there were also rules surrounding the activity itself, and one of those rules was that it was forbidden when a woman was unclean. What would be unclean, you ask? Well, of course, when a woman was menstruating or pregnant or breastfeeding or for 40 days after childbirth. These sorts of rules and views are thankfully outdated, as they make literally no sense at all, but their existence surely has proven harmful to even our modern views. In our number 6 spot today, we have the Court of Incompetence. We talked about how hard it could be to get a divorce in the medieval times and how it was nearly impossible unless you died or disappeared, but today we will talk about one of the ways you could potentially get a divorce, and that is in the Court of Incompetence. This is exactly what it sounds like, as women could apply for an annulment of their marriage if it turned out that their husband was incompetent. And yes, they really did have a way to test this. The test would be done by witness testimony, which explains itself, and I won't go into a lot of detail about that. Although kind of embarrassing and degrading, this might make the medieval times seem a little bit more progressive than they actually were, but do not be fooled. This was just to ensure that babies continued to be born and money continued to be shared. It certainly wasn't about anybody's happiness or anything absurd like that. In our number 5 spot today, we have the Patriarchy. In the medieval times, it is no shocker to us that men were considered the heads of the household. The men played a role and they were expected to love and honor their wives, but also to govern them. Women were expected to show their love by obeying their husbands. The women were considered to be peacemakers and were to ensure that their marriage stayed as peaceful as possible by fully submitting to their husband. This was mostly the worst for the marriages of nobles, as lower class marriages tended to be a bit more casual, but all marriages in these times were expected to have this kind of power dynamic. So basically, as a woman, you couldn't marry who you love or do anything that you wanted to. In our number 4 spot today, we have the landlord fee. In the medieval times, if you were someone who was renting land from another person, you could be subject to a fee upon getting married. But this fee would be paid to the landlord, who has absolutely nothing to do with the marriage. I couldn't imagine getting married and being forced to pay my landlord money because of it. Like, my rent isn't already high enough. This fee was only implemented if the bride had a dowry, but it just seems extremely bizarre. Maybe there was a perfectly reasonable explanation for this, but it truthfully seems a lot more like some sort of cash grab. In our number 3 spot today, we have lying to the courts. I spoke previously about how you used to be able to get married by just saying a few words, but of course there for some reason needed to be proof of marriage, and thus the push for the observation of God began. During this time, people began trying to enforce the disputed marriages, and many people were facing the courts in an attempt to prove their marriage was not just a sham. They would go into court and declare their love for each other, but there of course were people who took advantage of this. Some people who no longer wanted to be in the marriage would take advantage of this moment by never claiming any sort of love or affection to their supposed partner. Others would make up stories about the two being betrothed to each other in order to get a sentence of a wedding celebration. Sometimes it would turn out that one of the partners was actually already married and had just pretended in order to entice the other one into a night in bed, and sometimes if a woman had become pregnant, she would claim to have been married to the man who fathered the child. It truthfully was all quite messed up and very confusing, and it really was a game of he said, she said. In our number 2 spot today, we have double consanguinity. Double consanguinity is the case that comes up when there is consanguinity from 2 sources. In the medieval times, it was common for 2 siblings in one royal family to marry 2 other siblings from another royal family. The children of these couples would be considered double first cousins. They would be allowed to marry as first cousins, but they technically had an even closer biological relationship than regular first cousins did. This might be a little strange to a lot of us now, based on most of our ways and lives and the law, but these rules were formed before the concept of genetic relationships and DNA was even known, so there of course would be seemingly nothing wrong with it in these times. In our number 1 spot today, we have coercion. This one is quite dark, you guys, and it might be triggering to some people, so I just want you to proceed with caution on this one. Many researchers and historians have noted how many women in the medieval times who were kidnapped or sexually ended up marrying the men who did these things to them. Unfortunately, women didn't have a lot of resources, legal or otherwise, to escape the pressure put on them by these violent men, and were more so coerced into marriage than actually consenting individuals. It is also believed that many of the survivors of the more violent attacks ended up in the marriage because of the damage the attack did to their reputation, which is so incredibly heartbreaking. There's actually a record that we have of a spontaneous marriage after an abduction. We only have a few sentences the judge spoke, but he enforced the marriage of Michael Betton and Katerina Binkin, sentencing them to celebrate it properly. The records we have show how he abducted Katerina violently and against her will, but then she just spontaneously decided to marry him afterwards. Alright guys, that has been our list for today. Thank you so much for checking it out. Now I'm going to be shouting out some of your comments from the first part of this video that I did with Lindsay. Antonio Ernesto said, meanwhile in ancient Egypt and in Sparta, women could divorce if the man was not a good husband. They're just like living a nice life over there compared to all these medieval people. What the heck? They should have just went over there. Justin Cameron said, and people wonder why I remain single. These show me I made the right choice. Hopefully things have changed a little bit since the medieval times. I'm not married, so who knows? I can't speak for all the married people out there, but there's hope for us. Gabriel Solomon 111 said, Miss Kozlowski and Lindsay, hi. Hi Gabriel, how's your day going? Hope it's good. Thanks for watching our videos. Lindsay's not here, but I'll tell her you said hi too. Jordan95HD said, I'd love this medieval content to be made into a series, no matter what kind of video it is. Well, stranger things have happened. You never know what's coming up. Make sure you hit that little notification bell so that you don't miss an upload, because you never know what you'll see. Alright guys, that's all the comments I'm shouting out for today's comment portion. Make sure you comment down below and maybe you'll be featured in the next one. I've been your host today, Olivia Kozlowski, and I'll see you next time. Bye! These were the rules surrounding who was... There were rules surround... There were...